It was a chilly Friday morning in the heart of a small American town, the kind where the streets were lined with mom-and-pop shops, and the smell of fresh coffee and baked goods filled the air. The local diner, Maggie's Place, was a cornerstone of the community, known for its buttery pancakes and friendly atmosphere, or so people thought. Inside, the clinking of plates and the hum of casual conversations echoed against the old checkered floors. At first glance, it seemed like any other day. But for one man, this visit would be anything but ordinary. He walked in quietly, dressed in a crisp military uniform, his polished boots clicking softly on the floor. His name was James Carter, a young soldier who'd just returned from deployment overseas. There was a calm strength in his demeanor, the kind that only comes from enduring what most couldn't imagine. For James, this stop at Maggie's wasn't just about grabbing a meal. It was about reconnecting with the familiar, finding a slice of home in a world that often felt distant and cold. As he approached the counter, heads turned, some with curiosity and others with admiration. But not everyone in the diner shared the same sentiment. Behind the counter stood Rick, the manager, a tall, middle-aged man with a permanent scowl etched on his face. Rick had a reputation in town, not for his kindness, but for his sharp tongue and deeply rooted prejudices that he barely tried to hide. James smiled politely and asked for a table. Rick glanced at him, then at the uniform, and his expression darkened. "We don't serve people like you here," Rick snapped, loud enough for others to hear. The air seemed to freeze. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as diners exchanged uncomfortable glances. James, stunned but composed, asked, "Excuse me." Rick leaned forward, his voice dripping with disdain. "I said, we don't serve your kind. Go eat somewhere else." For a moment, James didn't respond. His jaw tightened, but his eyes remained steady, unwavering. Around the diner, whispers began to ripple through the crowd. Some looked away, too afraid to intervene, while others seemed to silently urge James to leave to avoid further humiliation. But James didn't move. He stood tall, his uniform a stark contrast to the hostility being thrown his way. "I fought for this country," he said, his voice calm but firm. "For all of us, including you." Rick scoffed. "I don't care where you've been or what you've done. You're not welcome here." The tension in the room was palpable. A young waitress near the kitchen door looked horrified, her hands trembling as she clutched a tray. An older man at a corner table muttered, "This isn't right," but didn't dare speak louder. James took a deep breath, his hands clenching at his sides, not out of anger, but to steady himself. He wasn't one to cause a scene, but something about this moment felt different. Something about it felt bigger than just him. "I'll leave," he said finally, his voice steady. "But not because you told me to. Because I won't lower myself to your level." He turned to leave, and as he did, the room remained silent, the weight of the moment hanging thick in the air. But just as James reached the door, he paused. Slowly, he turned back, his eyes scanning the room, taking in the faces of everyone who had watched without stepping in. And then, with a calm resolve that sent chills through the room, he said, "You'll regret this." Without another word, James walked out, leaving a diner full of stunned patrons, and a manager who had no idea just how much those words would come back to haunt him. Outside the diner, the crisp morning air felt colder against James's skin. He took a deep breath, his breath visible in the chill, and adjusted his jacket. The streets seemed quieter now, as if the whole world had paused after what just happened. But James wasn't the type to let anger consume him. He had faced far worse in his life, situations where he had to make decisions in seconds, where lives hung in the balance. This, he thought, was just another battle. A different kind, but a battle nonetheless. As he walked away from the diner, James couldn't help but think about his journey to this moment. He had grown up in a small town not too far from here, raised by parents who had taught him the value of respect, hard work, and standing up for what was right. His father, a proud veteran, had always said, "Son, the uniform isn't just fabric. It's a promise. A promise to protect everyone, even those who don't see you as their equal." Those words echoed in James' mind now, grounding him as he replayed Rick's hateful words. It wasn't the first time he'd encountered prejudice, but something about today stung deeper. Maybe it was because he had just returned from a deployment where he had fought alongside people from all walks of life, different races, religions, and backgrounds, all united by a common purpose. To come home and face this kind of hostility felt like a betrayal. James's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind him. He turned to see the young waitress from the diner hurrying toward him. She looked nervous, glancing over her shoulder as if she expected Rick to come storming out after her. "Wait," she called out, her voice shaky. James stopped, watching her approach. She was barely out of her teens, with wide, earnest eyes and a name tag that read Megan. "I'm so sorry," she said, catching her breath. "I didn't know he'd do something like that. He's not a good person, but I never thought he'd go that far." James offered a faint smile, appreciating her courage to speak up. "It's not your fault," he said gently, "but thank you for saying something." Megan hesitated, fiddling with the edge of her apron. "You didn't deserve that. No one does. And for what it's worth, not everyone in there feels the way Rick does." James nodded. "I could tell. But sometimes saying silence says just as much." Her face flushed with guilt, and she looked down. "You're right," she murmured. "I should have said something. We all should have. But Rick, he's the boss, and he's not exactly kind to people who cross him." James studied her for a moment. She seemed genuine, caught between fear and a desire to do what was right. "It's never easy to stand up," he said after a moment. "But the more people let someone like that get away with it, the worse it gets." Megan nodded, biting her lip. "I'll try to do better," she promised. "You already did by coming out here," James said. "Thank you." She smiled, a small, hesitant smile, and then turned to head back to the diner. James watched her go, hoping his words had made an impact. People like Rick thrive on silence and fear, but it only took one person to start a ripple of change. James continued walking, his mind now racing with thoughts of what to do next. He wasn't the type to let things slide, but he also knew that confronting Rick directly wouldn't solve anything. People like him didn't change overnight, if at all. No, James had a different idea, one that would require patience, strategy, and a little help from the community. Later that afternoon, James found himself sitting at his kitchen table, phone in hand, scrolling through his contacts. He had stayed in touch with many of his old friends from the town, as well as some of his fellow soldiers who had settled nearby. If anyone understood the importance of standing together, it was his military brothers and sisters. He made a few calls, each conversation brief but impactful. "I need your help," he'd say, explaining the situation. The responses were immediate and supportive. "We've got your back," one friend said. "Just tell us where and when." By the time the sun began to set, James had a plan in place. It wasn't revenge he was after. It was accountability. People like Rick needed to be shown that their actions had consequences, not through anger or violence, but through unity and strength. The next morning, the diner was unusually busy. Word had spread quickly through the small town, and people were curious about what was happening. James' friends and fellow veterans had shown up in force, dressed in their uniforms, sitting at tables, and ordering breakfast as if it were any other day. Rick, who had arrived early, was immediately on edge. He recognized James as soon as he walked in, flanked by two other veterans. The sight of so many uniforms filled the room, creating an undeniable presence that couldn't be ignored. "What is this?" Rick barked, his face turning red. James stepped forward, calm and composed. "We're here to support a local business," he said, his tone even. "Isn't that what you want? Customers?" Rick's eyes darted around the room, taking in the sea of uniforms and the civilian patrons who had come to watch. He looked cornered, but he tried to maintain his bravado. "I don't need your kind here," he spat. "Then you don't need anyone," a voice said from the back. It was Megan, standing with a tray in her hands, her voice louder and stronger than it had been the day before. She placed the tray down and walked over to stand beside James. "Because if you're kicking him out, you're kicking me out too." Rick's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. But before he could respond, another voice chimed in. "And me." It was the older man from the corner table, the one who had muttered under his breath the day before. He stood up, followed by his wife. "We won't support a place that treats people like this," he said firmly. One by one, more patrons began to stand, their voices joining in solidarity. Rick's confidence crumbled as he realized the tide had turned against him. James watched the scene unfold, a sense of hope swelling in his chest. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about a community standing together against hatred and prejudice. But James knew this was only the beginning. The real change would come in what happened next, in how the town chose to move forward from this moment. For now, though, he let the power of unity speak louder than any words ever could. The tension in the diner was thick enough to cut with a knife. Rick stood rooted to the spot behind the counter. His face flushed with anger and embarrassment as more people began to voice their support for James. It was clear that the community wasn't going to let this moment pass quietly. Yet Rick, stubborn and set in his ways, couldn't bring himself to back down, even as the walls of his authority seemed to close in around him. "Fine." Rick finally snapped, slamming his hands down on the counter. "If you're all so eager to play hero for him, then go ahead. But don't think I'll just stand here and take it. You think you can humiliate me in my own diner." James stayed calm, his expression unreadable. He had seen this kind of reaction before. People like Rick, who didn't know how to handle being challenged, often lashed out in desperation. But James wasn't here to fight him. He was here to make a point, and it was clear that the crowd had already started to see through Rick's bluster. Meanwhile, Megan stood her ground beside James, her shoulders squared despite the nervous energy radiating from her. She had made a decision to stand up for what was right, and even though her heart raced, she wasn't going to back down now. "Rick, you don't get it, did you?" she said, her voice firm, but not aggressive. "This isn't just about James. It's about the way you treat people. Everyone here is tired of it. They're tired of being scared to speak up because you're the boss. Well, guess what? You're not untouchable." Rick's eyes narrowed, and for a moment it seemed like he might explode. But before he could say anything, one of the veterans at a nearby table stood up and cleared his throat. "Rick," the man said, his voice calm but commanding, "my name is Sergeant Bill Harper. I served in the Marines for over 20 years, and I've been coming to this diner since I moved here. I've seen you treat people poorly before, but this is different. You disrespected a man who's given everything for this country, and you did it in front of all of us. You think we're going to let that slide?" Rick glared at Bill, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He opened his mouth to respond, but another voice interrupted him. "And what about us?" It was an older woman sitting near the window, her face lined with years of wisdom. "I've been coming here since Maggie owned this place. She ran it with kindness and respect. She treated everyone like family, no matter who they were. Do you think she'd be proud of what you've turned it into?" The mention of Maggie, the diner's original owner, seemed to hit a nerve. Rick's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. As the crowd continued to voice their discontent, James noticed something in Rick's demeanor, something beyond the anger and arrogance. There was fear. Fear of losing control, of being exposed for what he truly was. It was a fear James had seen in others before, and he knew it was a sign that Rick wasn't as untouchable as he wanted everyone to believe. But James also knew that this wasn't just about Rick. It was about the community and what they chose to stand for. He turned to face the crowd, his voice steady and clear. "This isn't about me," he said, addressing the room. "This is about all of us. About who we are as a community. Are we the kind of people who let hatred and prejudice go unchecked? Or are we the kind of people who stand up for what's right, even when it's hard?" The room fell silent for a moment as his words sank in. Then, one by one, people began to nod, their resolve strengthening. Rick, sensing that he was losing control of the situation, tried to regain his footing. "You think you're all so righteous," he sneered. "But you don't know what it's like to run a business. You don't know the pressure I'm under." James met his gaze, his expression unflinching. "Pressure doesn't excuse hatred," he said simply. For a long moment, Rick didn't respond. His gaze flicked around the room, taking in the faces of his customers, his staff, and the veterans who had come to support James. It was clear that he was outnumbered, but his pride wouldn't let him admit defeat. Finally, he turned and stormed into the back of the diner, slamming the door behind him. The sound echoed through the room, and for a moment, no one spoke. Then Megan broke the silence. "Well," she said, her voice shaky but determined, "I guess that's that. But we're not done here, are we?" James smiled faintly, appreciating her courage. "No," he said, "we're just getting started." Over the next few days, the story of what happened at the diner spread like wildfire through the town. People talked about Rick's actions, about James' calm response, and about the way the community had come together to stand against injustice. The incident became a catalyst for change, sparking conversations about prejudice, accountability, and the kind of town they wanted to be. But Rick wasn't about to go down without a fight. From the privacy of his office, he began plotting his next move, determined to regain control and silence his critics. He wasn't ready to admit it yet, but deep down, he was beginning to realize that he had underestimated the power of the community and the quiet strength of the man he had tried to humiliate. The days following the incident in the diner were anything but quiet. The town buzzed with conversations about what had transpired. Some residents were furious at Rick's behavior, while a small number of his staunch loyalists tried to justify his actions. The majority, however, seemed to lean toward change, recognizing that the diner had become a reflection of something darker in their community. James continued to go about his life with the same steady resolve that had carried him through the most challenging moments of his service. He didn't want the spotlight, but it found him anyway. Strangers approached him on the street, shaking his hand and thanking him for his service, while apologizing for what he'd endured. The attention was overwhelming at times, but James knew it wasn't about him. It was about the broader message. Megan, however, was not one to let things simmer. She rallied the staff, many of whom had remained silent under Rick's oppressive management. For years, they had endured his temper and unfair practices, but now, emboldened by James's courage and the support of the community, they began to speak out. One of the waitresses, a soft-spoken young woman named Clara, confided in Megan about the time Rick had docked her pay for taking a sick day, despite her providing a doctor's note. Another cook revealed that Rick had refused to hire someone based on their appearance, claiming they wouldn't fit the vibe. The stories were heartbreaking and infuriating, and Megan made it her mission to collect them all. Meanwhile, Rick stayed out of sight, retreating into the back office of the diner and avoiding direct confrontations. But his absence didn't mean he wasn't plotting. He was determined to regain control of the narrative and his business, and he knew just how to do it. A week later, Rick emerged with an announcement. He had arranged for a local journalist, someone he knew was sympathetic to him, to write a piece about the disruption at the diner. The article painted Rick as a hard-working businessman under attack by an unruly mob who didn't understand the pressures of running a small-town eatery. It portrayed James as a troublemaker who had stirred up unnecessary drama. The article hit the town's local news site, and while it garnered some support from Rick's allies, it also sparked outrage. People who had been at the diner that day flooded the comments section, detailing what they had witnessed and calling out the article's inaccuracies. The divide in the community deepened, and tensions rose. James, who had tried to stay out of the escalating drama, found himself dragged back into the fray. He was sitting on the front porch of his modest home when Megan showed up, a determined look in her eyes and a folder clutched in her hands. "You need to see this," she said, holding out the folder. James opened it to find a collection of statements from the diner's staff and customers, detailing their experiences with Rick. Some of the stories were shocking, others heartbreaking. Megan had even included copies of receipts and pay stubs that backed up some of the claims. "This is bigger than just you or me," Megan said, her voice firm. "Rick's been getting away with this for years, and it's time someone held him accountable." You've already inspired people to stand up. Now we need to take the next step. James sighed, running a hand through his hair. Megan, I didn't come back here to cause trouble. I just wanted some peace. I know, Megan replied softly. But sometimes standing up for what's right means giving up that peace. You did it for your country. Can you do it for your town? James looked at her for a long moment before nodding. All right, he said. Let's do this. Together, they began to organize. Megan reached out to the local Veterans Association, who were more than willing to lend their support. James spoke at a town meeting, sharing his story and urging others to come forward with their experiences. The movement grew, and soon it wasn't just about the diner. It became about the kind of community they wanted to build, one where everyone was treated with dignity and respect, regardless of who they were. But Rick wasn't backing down. Late one night, as James was locking up his small woodworking shop, he noticed a shadowy figure lingering nearby. Before he could call out, a rock flew through the window, shattering the glass. James rushed outside, but the perpetrator was already gone, leaving behind only the sound of retreating footsteps. The message was clear. Rick was willing to play dirty to protect his position. James reported the incident to the local authorities, but there wasn't much they could do without evidence. Still, the attack only strengthened his resolve. He wasn't going to let fear stop him from doing what was right. As the diner became the epicenter of the town's growing conflict, the tension reached a boiling point. People began to gather outside, holding signs that called for Rick to step down. Others came to support him, creating a volatile mix of emotions that threatened to spill over at any moment. Inside the diner, Rick sat in his office, staring at the growing crowd through the window. He could feel the walls closing in, the weight of his decisions bearing down on him. He had always thought of himself as untouchable, but now, for the first time, he wasn't so sure. James stood at the edge of the crowd, watching as the community he had grown up in wrestled with its identity. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew one thing for certain: this wasn't over. The storm was coming, and everyone could feel it.